The River Witch of Suncheon, a Korean horror story gangi joju. The curse of the river Rani was 13 years old and had been the head of her household for 6 months. She lived in a small fishing village on the outskirts of Suncheon in South Jeolla province, where the wetlands met the forest and the river ran dark and deep through the middle of everything. Her family had fished that river for 3 generations: her grandfather, her father, and now, by necessity, her. Her father had gone to the river one morning in early spring and had not come back. The village men had searched for 3 days. They dragged the river in sections. They walked the banks for kilometers in both directions. They found his fishing basket on the bank, his net half deployed in the water, his rubber boots arranged neatly side by side at the water's edge as though he had simply stepped out of them and continued without them into somewhere else entirely. They found nothing else. Rani's mother was ill, had been ill for years, a slow and grinding illness that kept her in bed more days than not. The fishing income had been modest but sufficient. Without it, the family had very little. Rani had a younger brother who was 8 and a mother who needed medicine that cost money. She taught herself to fish. Her father had taken her to the river many times throughout her childhood, and she had absorbed more than she'd realized. How to read the current, where the fish gathered in different seasons, how to set a net so it moved with the water rather than against it. She was competent more quickly than anyone would have expected, including herself. The problem was the other fishermen. The village fishing grounds were technically open to anyone, but in practice they had been divided by informal agreement among the adult men over decades. And those men had no interest in sharing their portions with a 13-year-old girl whose presence they found inconvenient in ways they didn't examine too carefully. They told her the main river was too dangerous for a child. They said she would disturb the fish. They gave her various reasons that all meant the same thing: go somewhere else. Rani needed income. She had no choice but to find another water. There was talk in the village, always had been, of a river on the other side of the forest. The forest that covered the eastern half of the village's territory. Dense, old growth, the kind of place that absorbed light and sound and returned neither. Nobody went there. The reasons given for this varied: difficult terrain, no clear path, unstable ground near the water. But underneath the practical reasons was something older and less articulable, the kind of collective avoidance that accumulates over generations without anyone quite remembering how it started. Rani's father had mentioned the forest river once. He had been the kind of man who told his daughter stories about water, about how rivers had moods, about how they showed you things that reflected what was inside you, about how you had to pay attention to what the water was trying to say. Rani had thought these were just stories. She packed her equipment one morning and went into the forest. Even in daylight, the forest was dark. Not the pleasant, cool shade of ordinary trees, but something denser. The canopy overhead so complete that the midday light came through filtered and greenish, like light through deep water. Bats moved through the middle distance despite the hour. Something slithered through the undergrowth to her left, and she did not look at it. She followed the sound of water. The river appeared through the trees, narrower than the main river, darker, with a quality to its surface that was hard to describe. Still in places where it should have moved, moving where it should have been still. The banks were soft black mud that held the impressions of things that had come to drink. She could not identify all of the prints. She knelt at the bank to drink from her water bottle and looked at her reflection. Her father's face looked back at her. Not her own face. His. Clear, distinct, looking up at her from the water with the particular expression he wore when he was concentrating on something. She jerked backward and nearly fell, and when she looked again, the surface showed only her own face, pale and wide-eyed, and the trees reflected above her. She told herself it was the light, the strange greenish light through the canopy making her imagination work too hard. She set up her net. She was in the process of throwing the weighted edge into the current when her foot slipped on the wet bank and she went in. The water was cold in a way that felt wrong, cold from somewhere deep, cold that had nothing to do with the season. She was not a strong swimmer. She found the bottom with her feet and pushed toward the bank, got her hands on the mud and pulled, and she was almost out when something grabbed her ankle. Not a current, not a root, something deliberate. Fingers, or what felt like fingers, wrapping around her ankle bone and pulling her back with a strength that was entirely incompatible with the empty water behind her. She kicked hard. Whatever held her released. She scrambled up the bank and turned around. Nothing in the water. No ripple, no disturbance. The surface as still and dark as before. She stood on the bank soaking wet and breathing hard and looked at the river. Then she noticed the red cloth. It was moving upstream, against the current, which was wrong, floating toward her with a directness that suggested purpose rather than drift. It snagged on a root at the bank's edge directly in front of her and stopped. She recognized it before she touched it. Her father's gamshi, the red cloth he had worn around his neck every day for as long as she could remember. The one he said kept away bad luck. He had been wearing it the morning he left for the river and did not come back. She picked it up with shaking hands. She told herself it had washed downstream from the main river. She told herself it could have traveled far in 6 months. She told herself the reasonable things and believed none of them. She turned to get the fish bait from her bag and found the bag open. She had not opened it since entering the forest. Inside, between her provisions, was a photograph. She had not packed any photograph. It was her father. A photograph she recognized, taken at a village festival years ago, him smiling with his arm around her mother. But someone had scratched out his eyes. Deep marks, like something sharp drawn repeatedly across the paper until the image was destroyed in those 2 specific places. Rani put down the photograph. She put down everything she was holding. She walked to where her net entered the water and gathered the rope to pull it back in. The net moved. Strong, irregular movement. The kind that meant something large. She pulled harder, hand over hand, the rope burning her palms. The net came out of the water. Inside, it was a man. Inside, it was her father. She understood, in some part of herself that processed things below the level of conscious thought, that she was looking at what 6 months of river had done to a body. That this was an answer to a question she had been asking. That the mystery of where he had gone was resolved. She screamed. She kept screaming for a while. Then she stopped because screaming was not helping and she needed to think. She began to pull her father's body toward the bank. She pulled it free of the net, and the moment it was fully out of the water, she saw what the river had done to it. Or rather, what she understood with cold certainty was not something the river had done. The torso was partially missing, not decomposed, not damaged by water or fish or the ordinary processes of death in a waterway. Something had consumed it. Something with a large mouth. Before the horror of this could fully take hold of her, the water moved. Not a current change. Not a fish or an animal breaking the surface, something rising. She emerged from the river the way things in nightmares emerge. Gradually, as though the river were giving her up reluctantly. First the hair, dark green-black and plastered flat, covering the face. Then the shoulders. Then the torso. A woman, or the shape of a woman, standing in water that reached her waist, facing the bank, facing Rani. Moss on her skin, teeth too long and too numerous for a human mouth. Eyes that were wrong in a way Rani could not look at directly. Not the color or the size, but something about the quality of attention in them, the intelligence that was not human intelligence. Around her, the river began to change color. Blue to gray to something darker, spreading outward from where she stood, until the water in both directions was the color of old blood. The woman smiled. Rani ran. She did not stop running until she reached the forest edge and the village beyond it. She ran through the village and did not stop at her house, but continued to the home of the village elder, an old woman named Grandmother Bay, who had lived in Suncheon for 80 years, and who Rani had sometimes seen making small offerings at the riverbank on certain mornings. Grandmother Bay let her in without comment and sat her down and gave her hot water to hold and waited for her to be able to speak. When Rani finished telling her everything, The old woman was quiet for a long time. Then she told Rani what her father had never told her. The version of the river stories that the adults knew. The forest river had a name among the old families. Hegwi Gang, the Ghost River. It had been called that for generations, and the reason was not superstition but accumulated experience. People who went to that river sometimes came back with things they hadn't brought with them, not objects but impressions, dreams, feelings of being followed. And occasionally people who went there did not come back at all. The creature that lived in it was not a recent thing. It was old enough that nobody remembered a time before it. Old enough that the reasons for what it was had been lost and only the fact of its existence remained. What the village knew was this. It did not tolerate the taking of fish from its river, and it had particular tastes. "Your father was a good man," Grandmother Bay said. "He went where he should not have gone, and she kept him." She looked at Rani steadily. "You went where you should not have gone too. But you came back. That is not nothing." Nobody in the village believed Rani's account, or admitted to believing it. The police were informed of the discovery of her father's body and conducted a brief investigation that concluded with findings they listed as inconclusive. The body was recovered. She had given clear directions to the location, and her father was given a proper burial. The missing torso was listed in the report as consistent with large freshwater predator activity. Nobody in the village fished the forest river. This did not change after what Rani reported. It had not changed for generations. The informal prohibition continued exactly as before. Rani stopped fishing entirely. She set up a small vegetable cart at the village market and earned enough to cover her family's needs. Less than fishing had provided, but sufficient, and it kept her on land and away from water, which had come to feel important in a way she didn't try to explain to anyone. She moved her cart from location to location depending on the day, and there was one particular route she never took. The road that ran near the forest's eastern edge, where on quiet mornings you could hear, if the wind was right, the sound of the river moving through the trees. She knew what else you might hear if you listened long enough. The sound of something in the water, moving toward the bank, and a smile that she had seen once and would spend the rest of her life not forgetting.